Hello to everybody. Thanks for joining this session. As Jonathan mentioned, I'm going to talk about building a successful API program. This won't be a deep dive technology talk on all the intricacies of REST or GraphQL or things like that. We're going to touch upon that, but this is more around how you can actually build an API program and really set yourself up for using APIs as part of your overall architecture, digital transformation journey, whatever it is that you're working towards, and why you want to utilize APIs. So just one slide on who I am and where we come from, the company that I work for. I'm the CTO of TIBCO Software, and the company itself has been around for almost 30 years. We really focus on providing enterprise software platform capabilities to Fortune 500-ish kind of customers. If you've ever shipped a package with FedEx, if you've ever taken a plane on pretty much any airline across the globe, if you've ever made some used iPhones in certain parts of the country, chances are you've interacted with our software at one level or another. And so we really focus on connecting information, bringing it together, unifying information through things like data management and data governance techniques, and then of course using AI/ML against that data. And as you can imagine, APIs are really an important, critical aspect to all of these different types of capabilities. And we're going to talk about how you can build a program to be successful with them today. So just to start, we all know that there's a lot of conversations in the industry around how you develop applications and systems. It's changed since the days where we would use things like enterprise service buses, where we would have conversations about SOA or web services, which WSDL version is the right version, which flavor of WSDL are we using for those that were using it way back when, in the days where there was different flavors, Microsoft, IBM, and so on. But nowadays, it's a lot of conversations around APIs, and it's around APIs and API-led integration, right? And really as an enabler for transforming your business. So that's a key aspect of what it is that organizations are looking at when it comes to APIs. How do I expose functionality within the organization to either other business units or my trading partners, or to consumer, and then how do I do so efficiently and with the best capabilities possible? And so I call this my buzzword compliance slide. APIs can be utilized, of course, in many, many different contexts. When you look at the way technology is evolving, we're really now working with a kind of a convergence of all kinds of new technologies all at one time. I mean, I often say it's a very exciting time to be part of the technology world these days, just because we're dealing with so many different technologies that are allowing for so much innovation, and it's all happening in a very compressed time period. So whether you're looking at cloud or whether you're looking at patterns like microservices, whether you're looking at sagas, or in case of my code, the let it crash kind of capability, let the infrastructure recover as opposed to coding for every possible permutation combination. These are all the different things that organizations are looking at. So obviously a key aspect of where APIs need to fit into. Now, APIs, of course, are also everywhere. I mean, this is an example of a web page. I'm just going to build this out a little bit here. But this one simple web page, just representing a product, of course, can actually consist of a variety of different API calls, whether it's APIs for the purposes of getting information about the product itself, whether it's the description, whether it's the image, whether it's the price, whether it's a recommendation that says, hey, you bought this last week, you should buy something like this week. APIs are really being used to serve all these different capabilities. And this is just a simple web page. And so the number of API calls here could be quite diverse, could be quite broad, and they're actually accessing potentially a number of different data sources underneath the covers. So APIs are critical, there's no doubt about it. It's really a great way to really enable new digital products, reduce your time to market, open up new partnerships, build that better interaction with your customers, and also prepare yourself for future innovation and capabilities, which probably one hasn't even thought of yet. And so APIs are really that driver for digital transformation, as the buzzword says, but really it's a driver for what I like to say innovation. So when you're building or thinking about an API program, there's many different aspects that one needs to consider. Right? So you've got anything from how do you just make money with APIs? Right? I want to be able to make money somehow. I want to be able to maybe monetize these APIs. This used to be a big discussion. It then became a smaller discussion, I would say recently, but it is still a key consideration of what organizations need to look at. Then, of course, you've got how do you staff it? Right? What are the roles that I need in order to make sure that my API program is successful? So we are going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how you build the business case for your APIs. So what are the things you need to consider if you are either starting the development or the establishment of an API program, or if you are justifying why it needs to increase. There's going to be a number of things you want to talk about when you're building the business case. And so that's a key aspect of this as well. Obviously, you want to understand your audience. You need to understand, who are you building the experience for, right? That's going to make you much more successful when you're actually building your API program. And this can apply whether you're building APIs for the purpose of internal consumption or external consumption. Then, of course, there's a whole API lifecycle that you need to follow, whether you're developing or building your API contracts. How are you going to test those contracts? How are you actually going to build the APIs themselves? What architecture are you deploying those APIs into? What architecture are those APIs supporting? And then how are you going to innovate for the future, right? What are some of the other things that you need to think about? So identify what to build, how to build it, and then build it. And then again, set yourself up for the future. And so these are some of the things that we're going to talk about here in the subsequent slides. So first, how do you make money? Now, this is really not just charging, if you will, for API access, although that is definitely one way to monetize your APIs. But it is also around how are you using APIs to reduce costs? How are you using APIs to increase revenue? How are you using APIs to really impact and influence the bottom line? Right? That's a large part of what APIs are giving you as well. And so I tend to break them down into different categories, different ways in which you can monetize your APIs. In this particular example, on the left-hand side, we've really got this notion of charging per call. Right? So that tends to be the simplest form of APIs and how APIs are actually being monetized, but it is not the only form, but it's one of the most obvious ones. Then, of course, you get into the value add part of this. So a lot of customers will say, well, if you buy into my SaaS platform, you get a certain level of capability. But if you buy the gold or platinum level, you get more capability. And oh, by the way, that capability includes access to APIs. So now you just don't interact with the platform via the user interface as an example. You now have access to the APIs that drive that user interface, and now you can use it for your own purpose. Right, so that's another example of how people can add value to their platform with APIs. And maybe it's when they charge for it as part of the upsell to the platinum package. Right? And it could just be bundled together with other features and capabilities as well. Of course, you can use it to drive new types of revenue activities, whether you're looking at using APIs to then drive an e-commerce site, or as many examples of just using APIs to drive other revenue generating activities. Whether you're using APIs to forge partnerships, so maybe by themselves the APIs are not that exciting, but when you combine them with other companies or other partners or other technologies, platforms, and so on, then that's when the value comes into play. Or one of the other ones that you see, and this is probably one that you see most often when you're dealing with APIs internally, this is using APIs to reduce cost, simplify application and software development, improve the speed at which I can deploy new capabilities, and so on. So we see this whole idea of improving operational efficiency as a key driver for an API program, especially those programs that are being used to manage and govern internal APIs. So these are just some examples, right? Ways in which people think about APIs. So monetization doesn't just mean charge for them. There's many kind of indirect ways in which APIs can influence the bottom line as well. Now, of course, what role do you need as part of your API program? So staffing the program is also very, very important. And I've listed some of the roles here. Now, this is not to say that your API team has to have an individual for every single one of these roles. One individual could actually meet the demands of many of these roles. It's not just this particular one per one relationship, if you will, right? So you may have an individual that is actually the evangelist, and he's also the product manager, and he also does some of the documentation. And it really depends on the size of the API program, the number of APIs that you've built and are supporting, the target audience for those APIs, how you are marketing them, whether they're internal or external facing. But all these roles are still important. You need to think about the role and at least make sure that you've consciously decided to dismiss the role as not needed, right? So I always say that these are all the ones that you need to think about. And whether you need them or not is up to you to decide. But you do need to figure out whether or not that's actually applicable to the way in which you're going to run your API program, either now or in the future. And don't forget about marketing, even if you're only focusing on building internal APIs. Right? There's an aspect of marketing within the organization that you need as well, whether it's just building awareness that these APIs even exist, or whether it's promoting the value of the APIs and the flexibility and agility that they bring. And that's still important, even if it's only for internal purposes. Now, when you're building these APIs and looking at how you want to monetize them and who's going to be working on them and so on and so forth, you also need to then think of what is the business case for your program? And what are the goals, right? You need to make sure that your API program is aligned to the goals of the organization. If the goals of the organization are to grow adoption of a particular capability for your product, then optimizing and focusing on the cost reduction is maybe not the best way to go about it, right? So you got to make sure that your program is aligned to the goals of the organization. And again, you want to make sure you're considering both the technical and business aspects of how you want to define and build out your business model. And so I tend to break it down. And this is one way in which I found can be very, very useful when you're structuring the conversation or going through the thought process of how you're going to really prove and showcase the business value of your API program. And so I used the business model canvas as an example. This is a standard technique that a lot of startups will use actually when they are building the business model behind what it is that they're offering. But I've adapted it to API programs. And so whether you're looking at things like, well, who are the key partners of my program? What are the key activities that are needed in order to establish or to grow or to sustain my program? Who do I need to do that? Who do I need the buy-in from? What is the value proposition behind my APIs? Is it about innovation or is it about reducing costs? Who are my customers? How are they going to be acquired? What channels am I going to distribute my APIs? Right? Am I distributing my APIs through a partner channel or is it direct to consumer? What are those segments? How am I going to group these different customers? Who am I going to target to and how am I going to target them? Right? What are my marketing programs going to look like? And then of course you have to look at cost and you have to look at revenue. Right? And then on the right-hand side, I've listed various metrics that you want to use as you're running your API program. And I always say, don't forget to measure right from the very beginning. Right? It's harder to actually measure when you get to the end of your API program and you've rolled out a bunch of APIs and now you want to collect metrics and measure the success. You should have been adding those hooks in throughout the entire process of developing that program and developing your APIs. So that's critical. Measure, monitor right from the very beginning all the way straight through to the end of the process. And when you present your business model, remember that you're going to be presenting it to different audiences. So presenting to the head of architecture is much different from presenting to the CEO, as an example. So very, very important aspect of building an API program. Make sure you know your audience. I've seen a lot of cases where people assume that APIs are just marketed to developers. And they forget that that may be true. In their case, it's not always true, but in their case, even if it is, well, which type of developer? There's a difference between the citizen developer, as you'll often hear, who's interested in wiring together two SaaS applications. That individual is potentially different from the developer that is your very hardcore open source type of developer. And the way in which you're going to reach them is likely going to be very different. Right? The materials that they're interested in, the value that they're interested in, the way you present that value, all very, very different. And so you need to make sure that you understand your audience and that you're focused on providing the right kind of experience for the right target audience. That's a key part of the success of an API program. And again, this applies whether it's internal or external. In both cases, you do need to still understand who you're marketing to, what message are you trying to convey, and what materials are best suited to helping those target individuals be successful with your APIs. And so that's a big part of it. Then you get into the API lifecycle. I mean, I've talked a lot about the upfront considerations, the business model, who staffs it, how you market it, how you make sure you identify the right target audience, and so on. Then you get into the, well, okay, now I want to build something. Right? How am I going to develop my APIs? And this, of course, is right from just the ideas that are associated with what APIs you want to build and present, all the way from design, development, testing, rolling them out, And then you've got kind of the tail end of your APIs, which are things like versioning, deprecation, and of course, monitoring is throughout this entire process as well. Right? And so I always tell organizations, as you're building APIs, think about how you're going to deprecate them. And it seems weird to talk about getting rid of something that you don't even have yet, but that should at least be in the back of your mind as you're developing these APIs, because at some point, yes, you can version them, or you can use schema evolution and things like that to make it easier to transition from one API to the next. But at some point, you want to identify those APIs that are just not providing any value to anybody. And so it just makes sense to deprecate them. And that could make it easier on you. It's just less code, less things to support, less things to document, all those kinds of things, if there simply isn't any value to those APIs. So there's a tail end of this API lifecycle that is very, very important, along with, of course, the traditional design, development, testing, and all those sorts of things. And in a lot of cases, that first step where you're actually designing your APIs, that API contract that you create is key. And that API contract can be used to drive a lot of activities in all the subsequent stages of the API lifecycle. And so whether you're using things like the Open API specification, GraphQL and associated schemas, JSON schemas, async API spec, there's a lot of specifications, guidelines, and things like that you want to consider when you're developing your APIs. And a solid API model is really the core key foundation. And once you have that, it can drive a lot of other activities. So you can use it to obviously drive even creation of documentation. And you can create your Swagger documentation. You can create other metrics and other types of documentation, again, just based upon that contract. You can drive the creation of code stubs, right, from that API contract. And so that's a very key aspect of this. Automation is critical. Make sure you're automating as much as possible. Right? You want to understand that CI/CD, pipelines, automation, that's the only way you're going to really get the benefit out of what APIs are bringing. Or not the only way, but one of the key critical aspects of the success of your API program. All right, and then when you are going through this process, you're modeling, you're testing, you're building, deploying, scaling, and so on, remember that you will want to test as early as possible. And I know this diagram looks a bit weird because I've got test right after model. Test, of course, would also apply after build and so on. And actually as part of your CI/CD pipeline also. But what I wanted to kind of point out here is that you can test your model through the use of things like mock applications, and you want to do so upfront, even before the microservice that backs that API is built. And that allows you to test the contract. It allows you to test what consumers are going to send you. It allows you to test responses back. It even allows you to put authorization authentication around the mock application to start testing that early in the cycle. The mock app becomes an important part of this overall evolution of how you're building your APIs. So test early, test often, automate it as much as possible, and remember that API contract is key. Then finally, yes, you can build these APIs, you can deploy these APIs, but you need to be able to manage these APIs. And the management is really around a number of different aspects. This could be something like the management and deployment of a developer portal. Right? How am I going to allow developers to, now that I've marketed to them appropriately, how do I allow them to come and actually test my APIs, get API keys, actually use APIs to a level such that they feel comfortable talking to you further and about how they might use those APIs to roll them into production. Right? So an API management platform can facilitate just a lot of the other stuff that happens around the building of the APIs themselves. And then, of course, security, things like monitoring management, configuration of endpoints, setting up plans, creating APIs and further defining them as products. Again, going back to monetization, how are you going to do that? Facilitating change management. These are all things that you can utilize an API management capability for. And so it's up to you to decide, is it something you build? Is it something you buy? Maybe you can incorporate some kind of commercial products in with the rest of your program. It's going to be up to you to decide. And again, that goes back to the initial goals of the API program and what it is that you're trying to achieve. But it is important to have a central place for people to go to. You don't want all this information scattered all over. Then there's a lot of what's next. So people typically think about APIs with microservices. They think about it in a more request-reply style of interaction. Maybe it's back-end for front-end patterns. Maybe it's REST. Maybe it's GraphQL. Maybe it's combinations thereof. Maybe they're looking to build their front ends as micro front ends. So these are all technique strategies where APIs fit. But APIs are much more than that, right? You've got APIs at the edge. And so the evolution, proliferation, if you will, of 5G and 5G-related technologies over the next few years, APIs at the edge are going to become critical because we're going to have a lot more edge capability that's going to be deployed. AI/ML is also a key aspect of what can be added into an API program. And so you can use AI/ML as kind of the behind the scenes. This is the scoring engine that I'm invoking via an API. But you can also use it for things like analysis of your own API traffic. So if you're monitoring all your traffic, you can use different statistical techniques or even AI/ML to try and identify abnormal traffic patterns. And that may become very relevant and important to you. APIs can be very event-driven. So it's not just about asking an API a question and getting a response. It's about saying, well, here's my API. Whenever something of interest changes in the world of that API, notify me, right? Push the information to me. Do it immediately, right when that event occurs, right? So you've got this notion of a very event-driven paradigm with APIs, really to support the development of an event-driven architecture. Then you've got different ways to consume data. So whether you're talking about extended reality, whether you're talking about feeding information to a natural language processor, whatever that is, APIs can, of course, facilitate that. APIs are also involved when it comes to things like blockchain. How do I interact with a blockchain network? So APIs can facilitate that interaction. The development of very distributed what they call autonomous agents or BDI agents. This whole belief, desire, intent software model, that can be, of course, applicable here. And then there's always emerging standards. So whether it's open banking, whether it's a new distribution capability in the airline industry, whether it's FHIR from the healthcare space, there's always new emerging standards around APIs. And so those are things that we need to track and follow as well. And of course, that can be in different layers. So you can have APIs at different layers. You can have APIs dealing with data, APIs that are dealing with functions and processes, and it's likely that those are going to be mixed and mashed up, if you will, within your organization. So just to summarize, right? APIs, API programs, they really go together. You do need a number of considerations addressed when you're building a successful API program. Understand your target audience, understand the goals of the organization, align the program to that. Make sure that everybody understands what those goals are and is working towards them, and make sure that you're going through that API lifecycle journey and ensuring success through the development of your program. For anybody that's interested, there is a book available on this, and the speaker might be the author of that book, but feel free to check it out. It's on special rate right now off of Amazon, so you can check out the book, download it, and get some more information on how you can be successful with your API program. Thank you very much. Appreciate it, everyone. Have a good rest of the conference.